Okay, this is going to be a short presentation on endocrine glands, chapter 20. And this is a diagram of the body here pointing out some of the glands that have an endocrine function. There are glands that are dedicated endocrine glands, and then there are some of the other organs of the body that also have an endocrine capability. So what's the whole idea with the endocrine system is that some of the body's responses are not well adapted to just having neurons, having the nervous system signal. Instead of having an electrical signal, it makes sense to send out a chemical signal to various parts of the body, and then you've got the whole body in sync pretty quickly. So if you dump something into the circulatory system, the whole body is going to see that molecule. And it doesn't take much. The cells are very sensitive to tiny concentrations of hormones. So we've all heard about hormones, right? That they're these signaling molecules. They're fairly simple, small molecules, and they're distributed in the circulatory system, and they have these effects. Sometimes their effects are localized, so they can be paracrine or juxtacrine, or even autocrine. And those responses mean that that they can either stimulate them, the cells that are making them can stimulate, themselves can be stimulated by secretion of a hormone. So for example, they give an example of insulin-like growth factor in the autocrine type, where the organs, the tissue that's making insulin-like growth factor can also respond to it. The master organ involved with endocrine function is the pituitary. So they really spend a lot of time on the pituitary. I think that the two that are most likely to be asked on an MCAT type of exam would be pituitary, and then the islet cells on the pancreas. So those are really the ones that I'm the most likely to ask you more detailed questions about. You need to know a little bit about thyroid too. Okay, so what is it that's so interesting about pituitary gland? Well, the pituitary is this tiny gland up here, and it's dangling off the hypothalamus. And on the other side, there's also a tiny gland posterior to that, and that's the pineal gland. So the reason why that's interesting, the pituitary then is part of your brain. It's so close to the brain, and it has this capability of sending out a bunch of small molecule signals to the rest of the body. So that's very powerful because it can be influenced by what's being interpreted by the brain. So it has some ability to make sense of some more complex signals on a neuronal level. So so we were just saying that the reason to have an endocrine system is because you don't want everything to be regulated just by the brain and have the electrical impulses through neurons be responsible for all of these pleiotropic effects that the body needs to have. And so then you've got this endocrine gland that's right next to the brain. It's a budding off part of the brain. And actually the pituitary gland arises from cells that are in the top plate of the oral cavity. So part of the cells that make up the pituitary are from that, and then part of them are from the hypothalamus. So part of them are more neuronal-like. And so you've got a single gland there, the pituitary, that has a neuronal component and a somatic cell component coming from the oral cavity, from the palate. So let's see. So they call that the dual origin, the brain and the roof of the mouth. So there's a posterior and anterior. You know, when we're talking about the position of things biologically, posterior and anterior are good ones. What does that mean? What is anterior? Front. Posterior is therefore back. Right? So as we're facing each other, we're anterior. Our anteriors are facing each other. If I turn around, then that's posterior. So anyway, so when we're talking about looking at a patient and saying that one thing is anterior or posterior to another, it just means that it's more in the front of the person and something behind them is going to be posterior. What about top to bottom? So that in that case, it would be superior and inferior. So just to keep those things in mind. When the book makes mention of that, but this is not a a medical class, so we're not really getting into anatomy, physiology at that level. But I think it's useful to be aware of that. Okay, so then the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary are two different glands, but they're sort of melded together into one. And the anterior is the adenohypophysis, and the posterior is the neurohypophysis. And so, remember how in biology we were saying that one of the things you really need to understand is that there are synonyms. There's lots of synonyms. And so if you see the word hypophysis, then that they're referring to the pituitary gland. And so the anterior is the adenohypophysis, and it has these three different parts. And you're not responsible for knowing what those parts are, but they're pars distalis, pars tuberalis, and pars intermedia. And they give them those names because of the way the organ looks. And on the next picture, can I just go there? There you go. This is actually a pretty good picture. So we're talking about the pituitary because we're saying that the pituitary is kind of the master endocrine gland in the body. And it's able to signal several different categories of signals that are very powerful. And it's located dangling off the hypothalamus, which is in the brain. And so it is going to be influenced by what's going on in the brain. And one way to do that is through a blood supply. So there's the hypophyseal tract and blood supply, the hypothalamus. So it's connected at the base of the brain, and there's a vascular portal, and therefore peptides from the hypothalamus can be exchanged, and they can lead to the adenohypophyses. So so that's kind of shown here pretty well. So what kind of things are being made? Let's look at that. So we're just saying that this posterior part of the pituitary, you can just see that these two lobes are kind of next to each other, and that's why one's anterior and one's posterior. And then they like to show you how these, the cellular derivation of the organ, and it's someday this is going to matter a lot, I think. In terms of stem cells, it matters a lot, and the lineage, the embryonic lineage of these organs is kind of interesting, but Again, you're not really responsible to know that. It's kind of interesting, though, that one organ is coming from different locations. So certainly our perspective of the cellular perspective on tissues and organ development is the most accurate way to look at how organs are developed, because here you've got this organ and it comes from different places embryologically, and then they meld together. This is a histological picture. I won't show you that one either, but you can see that there are these two origins play out. So there's light staining cells and dark staining cells, and they represent the two different origins of the pituitary, and they divide up into the adeno and the neuro. Okay, so let's. So you can see that there's, again, within the hypothalamus, there is this paraventricular nucleus using oxytocin and also ADH. So that's how the hypothalamus can also influence what's going on. And then within the pituitary, it's all about the circulatory system, right? If you're going to be making small molecules and you're going to be distributing that to the body, then the arrangement of these vessels around the different portions of the pituitary are interesting. But I won't ask you to trace that either. But what I am interested in is, well, these pictures are always interesting, but is that you have this perspective. So here's the pituitary, and then you see all the different things that it can do. So it can make thyroid stimulatory hormone, TSH, which is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. Where's the thyroid? Can somebody point to the thyroid? Yeah, it's kind of sitting right here underneath your larynx, right in the anterior portion here. So it's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. What does thyroid hormone do? It's regulating like the whole metabolism of the body, sort of your general activity level. On a cellular level, too. Thyroid hormone will stimulate formation of, for example, mitochondria in cells, and will make them more energetically active. Okay, prolactin. Prolactin acts on mammary glands to stimulate milk production. So not so important to us, but during your infant years, it was important. So when the pituitary makes prolactin, then the mammary glands are going to be stimulated to make milk, and it's going to be available. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. They act on the gonads, which are testes and ovaries, stimulate development of gametes, sperm and oocytes. So this is your fertility here. This is your future family, your direct lineage. You came about because you had a certain amount, your parents had a certain amount of follicle stimulating hormone. And without the pituitary signaling that, then the gametes to form you would not have been available. So it's also pretty important response. Growth hormone. Growth hormone is another, broadly sort of pleiotropic effector hormone. It acts on all body tissues, especially cartilage, bone, muscle, adipose connective tissue to stimulate growth. So growth hormone is actually one of the first products that Genentech offered, human growth hormone. And it's used some by athletes to increase their strength, and it's hard to detect. So it's in that gray zone on performance enhancing substances that you can add to the body. But in general, I mean, we grow to the size we are based on growth hormone. So this is interesting perspective. If you give a mouse a dose of human growth hormone, if you inject human growth hormone into a mouse, what's going to happen? If you take a young mouse pup and you inject some human growth hormone, what do you think? Will you get longer bones? How much of an effect would you think it would have?
Do they have receptors for it?
They do. It turns out that they do, yeah. Yeah, the differences in the human growth hormones between different species are not very great, so our growth hormone will actually work for this. Also, you've seen cows, right? Bovine, BPH, is that what they have? So growth hormone. Well, it turns out that our size is pretty much largely determined by just growth hormone. So if you see somebody that's 4 feet tall and then you see somebody that's a 7-foot NBA player, it's actually growth hormone. And the evidence for that is also that if you get a cancer in the pituitary and human growth hormone is produced at an unusually large amount, you get gigantism. You'll generate people that are huge. If you take a mouse and you inject it with human growth hormone, the mouse gets as big as a rat. I mean, well, that's a lot bigger. So growth hormone is very powerful stuff. And if you have a low level of growth hormone, then you're going to be stunted in your growth. You'll be very small. So another powerful enzyme. And then adenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, acts on the adrenal cortex to cause release of corticosteroids. So that's a very important response. There are lots of different things going on there. The adrenal cortex, the adrenal glands are sitting above the kidneys. So they're suprarenal is one way to describe them. One way to remember what adrenal is suprarenal. So adrenocorticotropic hormone. Just remember the renal part of it. So for the kidneys, so these are sitting above the kidneys on both sides. And corticosteroids are hugely important for controlling. They're kind of the master steroid in the body. Cortisol. Cortisol is the typical one. They give it this example here. Cortisol. It relieves pain. It reduces inflammation. So it has lots of different functions, and it's in its own. The adrenal gland is its own endocrine gland. So it's controlling, this pituitary is controlling another adrenal gland. So you get the picture, right, from what I'm showing here, that the pituitary is kind of the master gland. It's the master endocrine gland. So you're most likely to be asked questions about the master gland as opposed to some of the subglands. But the master gland is producing these hormones and controlling some of these other glands. So the thyroid is also an endocrine gland, and the adrenal glands are also endocrine glands. So the neurohypophysis, so that's the posterior pituitary over here. That is the one that's making the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, which is also called oxytocin. And it's released response to blood ionicity. So that has a lot to do with controlling how much the renal collecting ducts collecting the water. Um, so that's going to have an effect on the kidney. More water is reabsorbed, and so it keeps an osmotic balance to your body fluids. So think of how important that is. I mean, these different examples we gave you, controlling overall body metabolism in the thyroid, hugely important, and it's controlled by the pituitary. But I mean, then it's controlled by the thyroid, because the thyroid has to make thyroid hormone. It's controlling milk production. It's controlling your fertility, ability to make sperm and egg. It's controlling your overall size and controlling ability, the immune response on a steroidal level, and pain. And there's a bunch of genes that are actually regulated by steroid hormones, and that's kind of a whole nother area. And then this thing we just talked about with the water uptake, water being needs to be absorbed, and you need to keep an osmotic balance in the body on all of the body's fluids. Again, controlled by the pituitary, but in this case, particularly the posterior pituitary, which is called this neurohypophysis. So, just know that a hypophysis is the pituitary, and that there's the one that's the more neuronal one, and there's the one that is the more somatic, which is the adenome hypophysis. Okay, the pancreas is the other one that I think is pretty important to know. Pancreas, because there's it's just a small group of cells, pancreatic islets. Let's see if we can see those. Okay, this is a diagram of pancreatic islets. They have different colored cells that they've used to label the alpha cell, beta cell, delta cell, and PP cell. So these are, they call them pancreatic akinus because that's a circle. Remember from the discussion on ducts, when you have a sac-like bag, that's an akinus. And so these grow that way. There's a lumen, and then they're growing around in a circle, so it's a sac-like duct. It's an akinus. So pancreatic islet cells, they're sitting on top of the pancreas, and there's a reticular capsule that surrounds each islet to separate it from the pancreas itself. So it's this small addition. It doesn't take that many cells to produce small amounts of hormone, right? So we don't need a liver. We don't need the stomach. We don't need something that's very large. We just need some cells. And in some cases, they're really just a few hundred cells can even make a difference. I think some of the delta cells that are making somatostatin in the pancreatic islets, those are really present in small numbers. So, what do the alpha cells or the A cells do? These are making glucagon, and glucagon controls glycogen breakdown in the liver. So, I mean, that's interesting. So the liver has this, it's kind of the enzyme factory for the body, and it's taking orders from these pancreatic islet cells, a couple of very small capsules on top of the pancreas, and it's going to control breaking down glycogen. So kind of, and that with the beta cells are making insulin, and so insulin What do you guys know about insulin? When you hear insulin, what do you think? That we need it, right? You know that you have a certain amount of insulin in your body, and it's coming on at different times. If you don't have enough insulin, what happens? If you're chronically low with insulin, what's that disease called? Diabetes, right? Yeah. So there's type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Well, what do we know about insulin? So it binds to a receptor. The receptors for insulin are receptor tyrosine kinases. They stimulate carbohydrate utilization and protein synthesis. So if you don't have enough insulin, you're going to be kind of tired, right? You're not going to be utilizing sugars effectively. What happens if you don't utilize sugars? You keep eating, right? Nothing's going to stop us from eating. So you go and you load up on food, and so then but you're not utilizing the sugars very well. So what's your blood sugar level going to look like? It's going to go high, right? If you don't have enough insulin, blood sugar is going to go high. So when blood sugar goes high, what's that called? It's hyperglycemic, right? You've heard of that before? So if you lose insulin, then the blood is going to be hyperglycemic. So that's type 1 diabetes. And this is, why do you need to know this stuff? This is so classic as far as health and the human body and all that. Insulin. Can any of our cells live without insulin? No. Insulin is this general signal in the body to take up sugars and metabolize them. So all of the cells have got insulin receptors on them. It's the receptor tyrosine kinase, which means it's a particular binding site, and when it binds, there's a phosphorylation cascade that goes on the receptor cell. So, insulin is a key molecule. In the laboratory, we grow human cells all the time. We have to have insulin there. If we don't add insulin in a purified form, we have to add serum. So there's going to be enough insulin in the serum that the cells will be maintained. But I can tell you that we constantly are aware of insulin, that the cells need insulin. Otherwise, they're not going to grow and divide. So insulin is a key molecule and a key example of endocrine function, and something that you guys should know about. And you should know a little bit about the diabetes situation, diabetes type 1 as being insulin-dependent diabetes, where there's a loss of these beta cells that are sitting above the pancreas, these pancreatic islet cells, and that there's just not enough insulin being made. And so then the body's short of insulin. What can you do if your body's short of insulin? You can add it, right? So you're going to inject some insulin. So these people that have type 1 diabetes are constantly injecting themselves to give themselves a dose of insulin. If they don't get the dose of insulin, their blood is going to go hyperglycemic. There's also type 2 diabetes, which is where the beta cells are present, but there's still not enough insulin. And so for some reason, the peripheral cells are not responding to the insulin. They become resistant. Obesity can be a factor in that, and also there seems to be some kind of multifactorial genetics. In my experience, whenever they talk about multifactorial, it means that they don't quite get it yet. So, we haven't quite completely understood that part of the equation. But anyway, you can't just inject insulin to treat a type 2 diabetic. Okay, so that's about it. We've kind of run out of time, but think about those two. Also, the thyroid hormone thing, the thyroid gland is going to be extremely important in regulating overall activity in the body. So you need that one too. Okay.